Okay, nature versus nurture. In other words, Model 1 versus Models 2 and 3. Or I-it relationships, thinking Martin Buber, versus I-thou relationships. Okay, Model 1 is about what derives from within the child, ultimately about nature, the internal dynamics, the internal dysfunctional dynamics. Models 2 and 3, however, are more about what derives as a result of or from within the relationship between parent and child. This is more nurture. So the pathology or the dysfunction in Model 1 is more a story about the child's nature, whereas the pathology or dysfunction in Models 2 and 3 is more a story about nurture. As we have just seen, classical psychoanalysts conceive of psychopathology as deriving from the patient, in whom there is thought to be internal conflict between an untamed id, pressing yes, and an ego, a weak ego made anxious, countering with a no, creating thereby structural or intrapsychic or neurotic conflict. Now, obviously, Freud knew that little children, have parents, but his focus was more on the internal landscape of internal neurotic conflictedness. That was his focus. But then the self-psychologists come along later, and relational theorists, and they conceive of psychopathology as deriving from the parent and the parent's failure of the child. In other words, self-psychologists and relational theorists focus not so much on nature, the province of Model 1, as on nurture, the province of Models 2 and 3. So whereas Model 1 is about the ego, Model 2 is about the self, and Model 3 is about the self in relation. Okay, so again, it's an issue of focus. So, okay, Models 2 and 3, the focus is on nurture, whether the quality, this is an important distinction, the quality of parental care, Model 2, or the mutuality of fit between parent and child, Model 3. Can you feel that difference? The quality of parental care is basically a story about the parent, the good enough mother, the parent. The mutuality of fit between parent and child is a two-person intersubjective contemporary relational perspective that has to do with the mutuality of fit, the interface between parent and child, the intimate edge, Darlene Ehrenberg, thank you, the intimate edge, and ultimately negotiating that. So Model 2, the quality of the parental care, a story about the parent. Model 3, a story about the fit, the mutuality of fit between parent and child, both people. Model 2, 1.5 person, Model 3, 2 person. But please note, yes, the critical distinction between quality of parental care as being a story about give, which makes of Model 2 a 1.5 person psychology, and mutuality of fit, a story about give and take, think projective identification, mutual enactment, which makes of Model 3 a 2-person psychology. More specifically, Model 2 and I-it relationship, a one-way relationship between someone who gives and someone who takes. And again, Model 2, self-psychology and other deficit theories are a story about corrective provision or deficiency compensation to fill in for structural deficit. It's an I-it relationship, the it being the object that provides, the empathic self-object that gives, a one-way relationship between someone who gives and someone who takes. That's fine, no problem, it's important, but by the way, and that would often have gone not so well early on for the child, so important that the child be able to get it now, and I-it, again, Martin Buber concept, relationship. Okay. Model 3, on the other hand, is more an I-thou relationship, a two-way relationship involving give and take, mutuality, reciprocity, and collaboration. And that's not what Model 2 is. Model 3, give and take, both having mutual impact, not necessarily equal or symmetrical, but mutuality of impact. The patient impacts the therapist, the induction phase of a projective identification, and the therapist impacts the patient, the resolution phase of a projective identification, for example. So give and take, mutuality of impact, reciprocity, and collaboration. Again, not necessarily equal, but present and recognized and acknowledged. This distinction is critical because a relationship between someone who actively provides and someone who is the passive recipient of such provision, Model 2, is a far cry from the more substantive relationship that exists between two real people. Real in quotes, because a point could be made that we as therapists, even in Model 3, are not always quite as real as we might be with some of the people with whom we're intimate on the outside. Nonetheless, our patients will, in Model 3, come to know us and our essence in a very profound way that's really, I find, quite exciting and quite wonderful. But in any event, so Model 2, far cry from the more substantive relationship that exists between two real people. Model 3, then, an intersubjective two-person relationship involving two subjects, two relational objects, as they're called sometimes. So Model 1 is about the therapist as a neutral object. Model 2 is about the therapist as an empathic self-object, experienced in essence as a part of the self, and Model 3 is about the therapist as an authentic subject or a relational object. These two subjects, patient and therapist, both of whom contribute to what transpires at their intimate edge. As we shall see, the emphasis in Model 2 is therefore not so much on the relationship per se, as it is on the filling in of the patient's deficits, again, structural deficit, internal absence of good because of deprivation and neglect. Model 2, as it is on the filling in of the patient's deficits by way of the therapist's corrective provision. The therapist gives, the patient receives. Or perhaps more accurately, as it is, Model 2, as it is, the therapeutic action, the emphasis on the filling in of deficit by way of working through failures in the environmental provision, right? That's the whole point that I've been making to this point. The optimal disillusionments, the optimal disappointments, the empathic failures. So it's not just corrective provision. The patient comes in, has deficits, and we give, but rather it will be the patient's working through of our inevitable failures to provide that will be the way in which the patient adaptively will then internalize those psychological or parenting functions or self-object functions that we really do provide. And as they adaptively internalize, transmuting internalization it's called, or structure/capacity building, as they do internalize, the patient does, those functions, it will fill in structural deficit. But again, I have embarrassed myself on numbers of occasions trying to explain to patients when I've been misguided enough to think that I could, the Model 2 and why it is that grieving optimal disillusionment, why it is that is ultimately to their going to serve them well. They say, why can't you just give it to me? And I try to suggest, well, it will be my not giving it to you, and you're working that through, which will involve, by way of grieving, which will involve adaptively internalizing all the good that I do, and thereby you'll fill in deficit and you'll feel better, when I've embarrassed myself a number of times, and then I got it that's not to be explained. So I don't explain it. It just is what it is. So grieving is a good thing. We'll get more into that later. But anyway, so So in Model 2, the emphasis is not on the relationship per se, but on environmental provision, and more specifically on failures in environmental provision. By contrast, the emphasis in Model 3 is truly on a two-way relationship between two authentic subjects, patient and therapist. I hadn't said that about the patient before, but the patient also authentic subject, therapist authentic subject, two relational objects. Importantly, as the etiology over the decades has shifted from nature, classical psychoanalytic way back, to nurture, for self-psychology, and then the more contemporary object relations approach, so too the locus of the therapeutic action has shifted from insight or awareness by way of interpretation, Model 1, from insight by way of interpretation, classical psychoanalytic, to a corrective experience by way of the real relationship. Now, I have a problem with that I just said, but I'm going to say it anyway for the moment until I sort of pick holes in it. But it's often described in the literature as, like, there are books and articles about interpretation versus holding. So a dichotomy between interpreting, and in the literature it'll be talked about as the more male function of interpreting. Again, that's kind of sexist, but that's the way it's been in the literature. The interpreting on the one hand and holding on the other. And when they talk about holding, they talk about a corrective experience by way of the real relationship. All right, that is, in any event, when they say that, they're talking about from the locus of the therapeutic action has shifted from insight by way of interpretation to include a corrective experience by way of the relationship. That is, from within the patient to within the relationship between therapist and patient. But now I want to kind of pick holes in that just a little bit. But actually, although there are still some who write about a corrective experience by way of the real relationship, this telescopes, from my point of view, two different concepts and obfuscates or obscures the critical distinction between a therapy relationship that involves give, Model 2, and a therapy relationship that involves give and take, Model 3. In essence, a corrective experience in the first instance, Model 2, a therapy relationship that involves give, a corrective experience, and Alexander and French talked about a corrective emotional experience, so give, and a real relationship, or as close to real as we can get, in the second instance, Model 3. So you see why I take issue then with sort of telescoping a corrective experience by way of the real relationship. No, a corrective experience, yes, an I-it relationship, a corrective experience to fill in ultimately structural deficit, it's all good, but that's different from a real relationship, a two-person intersubjective relationship where there's negotiating at the intimate edge of projective identifications and mutual enactments. Those are very different. So some people put Model 2 and Model 3 together. I don't. I make a very clear distinction between the more empathic Model 2, I-it, and the more authentic Model 3, two-person-y. A contemporary relational perspective. Another important clinical distinction. Whereas Model 2 theorists focus on the price the child pays because of what the parent did not do, deprivation and neglect, to which I've referred throughout, absence of good, deficiency, internally recorded in the form of structural deficit and impaired capacity, because structures perform functions, parenting functions, drive regulating functions, self-esteem regulating functions, whatever. Structures perform functions that enable capacity, adaptive capacity. So if there is absence of good, that will be internally recorded in the form of structural deficit and impaired capacity to be a good parent unto oneself. Deficits that then give rise to the desperate search for a new good parent. That wonderful little children's book, Will You Be My Mommy? Will You Be My Mommy? So these deficits, the structural deficit, the need, the deficit gives rise to the need to find externally that which one doesn't have was not able adaptively to internalize when one was a kid. So the deficit, the structural deficit, the impaired capacity will give rise to the desperate search for the need for external provision by a new good parent. Will you be my mommy? Relentless pursuits, ultimately fueling relentless pursuits in an effort to compensate for or correct for early on parental errors of omission. Errors of omission. So it is that Model 2, right, is a deficiency compensation or corrective provision model. I-it relationship, corrective provision, give, and the patient takes, which is fine. Give, patient takes, that's the backdrop, but then the actual growth happens as a result of working through frustration, optimal disillusionment, grieving that and adaptively internalizing the good that was there prior to the introduction of the bad, prior to the empathic failure. Okay, Model 3 theorists, however, focus on the price the child pays, not because of what the parent did not do, but because of what the parent did do, trauma and abuse. And they go hand in hand. It's never just, oh, well, my parent did bad, but it wasn't that they didn't do good. No. They often go hand in hand. So, for example, a critical parent, what they did do was they were critical. That's the bad. But the good that they didn't do is that they weren't accepting and approving and validating. So they often go hand in hand. So Model 3 theorists focus on what the price paid by the child because of what the parent did do, trauma and abuse, presence of bad, toxicity. Internally recorded and structuralized, so whereas Model 2 is about structural defect or deficit, Model 3 is about structuralization of these toxic, dysfunctional relational dynamics that went on between the parent and the child, structuralized in the form of pathogenic introjects or internal bad objects that are then compulsively and unwittingly, because you have these charged toxic boluses of unprocessed, unmastered relational trauma, victimizer, victim, seducer, seducee, criticizer, criticizee, these charged toxic pairs, we'll say more about that in a moment, that are then compulsively and unwittingly delivered into one's relationships again and again in desperate attempts to encounter different and better outcomes every next time. Compulsive repetitions in an effort to correct for early on parental errors of commission. Now, let me say, and I'll develop this a little further later, but in Model 2, it's the deficit that gives rise to the need for new good. In Model 3, it's the charged toxic boluses of internal presence of bad. So in Model 2, it's the absence of good that gives rise to the need for new good and the relentless pursuits for new good. In Model 3, it's different. You got the internal presence of bad, the charged toxic boluses that are then delivered into the relationship by way of projective identification. So it's the bad that gets delivered into the relationship in the hope that, though initially bad, ultimately it can be bad become good. Now that's complicated. No need to understand that right now, but I want to kind of get that out there because otherwise it's sort of like, well, wait a minute. Model 2 is relentless pursuit of new good. Model 3, desperate attempts to keep trying to get a better outcome this time, but keep trying to get bad to become good. And so on, and thereby to modify the internal bad, the internal toxicity. God, even I almost don't understand it. And I've been working with this stuff for 35 or 40 years. But I hope I said a little something there. Okay, so as it happens then, absence of good, Model 2, and presence of bad, Model 3, generally go hand in hand. Here we go. By way of examples, the child who was rarely praised and therefore developed structural deficit, impaired capacity to be self-praising, was probably also often criticized and therefore also developed internal presence of bad in the form of pathogenic interjects or internal bad objects, or as it's called in the literature sometimes, the bad mother. Again, sexist, so we'll say bad parent. The child who was rarely admired and therefore developed structural deficit and impaired capacity to be self-admiring was probably also often devalued and therefore also developed Model 3 pathogenic interjects. But these situations are not handled the same way clinically. As we shall later see, because we're almost at the end of this part, Model 2, absence of good, structural deficit, will create the need to find new good, not re-find it, but to find new good. Displacement, so by the way, not projection, but rather displacement. So displacement, think you used to have a yearning and longing. The little girl used to have a yearning and longing for her daddy, an Oedipal yearning and longing. That desire, that yearning, that longing, that need to win daddy over gets displaced onto the person of the therapist. And now the grown-up woman wants the therapist to love her, and she has all sorts of, the patient does, Oedipal yearnings and longings in relation to the therapist. So, and in the hope that the therapist, relentlessly hopeful that the therapist will provide. So let me say, I'm realizing we'll create the need to find new good. It's not really re-find new good. I mean, there might have been some good early on, but ultimately tragic heartbreak, which is why there's now deficit. And so it's the need to find new good, relentless pursuit of that, in the hope that one can finally get what one has been looking for one's entire life. Absence of good, structural deficit will create the need to find new good. Displacement of this need will give rise to illusion. Now let me highlight the distinction that some people make and I make between illusion and distortion, because illusion belongs in Model 2, distortion belongs in Model 3. Illusion has to do with positive misperception of reality. Distortion has to do with negative misperception of reality and involves pathogenic interjects. Illusion, positive misperception of reality, involves not projection of pathogenic interjects, Model 3, but displacement of need to find new good. The illusion, in fact, that maybe someday, somehow, some way, I will be able to find the new good that I never really had consistently and reliably early on. And now this is really critical. Remember I'd said these two things, absence of good and presence of bad, though they often go hand in hand, they're dealt with differently in the treatment. So here in Model 2 is all about displacement of need, the creation of illusion or positive misperceptions of reality, or sometimes we talk about idealizing the therapist, the idealized parent imago, whatever, but about positive transference. Sometimes we call it a narcissistic transference, but I want to call it a positive transference, whereby you are hoping and thinking and praying that you will, and you have finally found good. Of course, ultimately, Model 2 is a story about working through good become bad, illusion become disillusionment, grieving optimal disillusionment, adaptively internalizing good that was there apart from the bad. So here we go. So that's positive transference and positive transference disrupted. Model 2 is about positive transference and, which is illusion, and positive transference disrupted, which is disillusionment. It is not about negative transference. Negative transference is the province of projective identification, Model 3, and internal bad objects and pathogenic interjects that get delivered into the relationship, creating a negative transference, a distorted sense of the therapist as being critical. Although if indeed the therapist becomes critical, then projection becomes projective identification. That's Model 3. We'll get to that later. All right, so again, I'm just kind of introducing these ideas, wanting to get you comfortable, a little bit comfortable and familiar with Model 2 as being a story about positive transference and working through disruptions to the positive transference by way of grieving. So now it's positive transference, but ultimately disrupted positive transference, the therapeutic action model 2 will then involve working through, by way of grieving, not positive transference. So you don't work through positive transference, but you work through disrupted positive transference. All right, here is the slide. Model 3. Presence of bad, pathogenic introjects or internal bad objects, and they do exist as pairs because it's a dysfunctional relational dynamic. This will create the need to re-find old bad. I hope it'll become a little clearer why I kind of made a big deal out of Model 2 is about finding new good. Model 3 is about re-finding old bad. You have the projection of the pathogenic introject will give rise to distortion, which is, as we had said, negative misperception of reality and negative transference. Then the patient inevitably will exert pressure on the therapist to conform to the patient's expectation of being failed. And the patient will then get the therapist to fail them. Model 3, projective identification. That's when projection becomes projective identification, when the patient exerts a force field, thereby inducting the therapist into what becomes a mutual enactment. But so projection of pathogenic introject gives rise to distortion, which is a negative misperception of reality and negative transference, though I am acknowledging that if indeed the patient exerts pressure on the therapist to become bad, then in fact it's no longer such a distortion because it's the reality that in fact the therapist has become critical or is indeed being seductive or is indeed being rejecting. All right, but we'll get to that later. The therapeutic action model 3 will therefore involve working through, by way of negotiating at the intimate edge of authentic engagement, negative transference, the negative transference. Okay,